thank you everybody for being here. This is an exciting panel I've been looking forward to for some time since they'd asked me to moderate this. It's one of my favorite subjects. I am happy to welcome our distinguished panelists, Cynthia Campbell, who is the Water Resources Manager for the City of Phoenix, John Take, who is the Chief Innovation Officer and Executive Vice President at Stantec, and Justin Ehrenwerth, who is the President and CEO of the Water Institute. My name is Rhett Larson. I'm a professor of water law at Arizona State University. And the topic of our conversation is going to be the big pipe solution, or what some people might say is the pipe dream. Now, for many of you who work in the water field, for all of us, this is a question that we get asked a lot, and it's a question we're getting asked a lot more recently. And I'll be honest with you, in the past, I tended to sort of roll my eyes at this question and move it along, and I don't really know that I have the luxury to roll my eyes at this question anymore. It's something we have to take seriously. And one of the things that I think has been pushing us, at least initially, was it was understandable for people to look at a globe or a map of the United States and go, there sure seems to be a lot of green and blue over here, and a lot of brown over here. Why don't we just take some of the blue from here and move it over here? That was an understandable take, just by looking at a globe to decide to try and make that move. And they understood that you've been able to move oil for long distances. Why couldn't you move water over long distances? So one thing that we can get out of the way before we dive into the discussion is it feasible from an engineering perspective to build a really big pipe that moves water a very long distance? And that's a given. It's certainly possible to build that pipe. The question is, what are the obstacles? What are the comparative advantages and disadvantages? Which is why I want to start our discussion asking each one of our panelists, when your friends and neighbors and family members ask you this question, what do you say to them? When they ask, why not a big pipeline from a water-rich area to us, to a water-poor area, what is your response? We'll start with Cynthia.
Wow. Well, I think, you know, representing the city of Phoenix, you can never say never, right? We're the recipient of probably one of the more recent engineering feats in that sense. The Central Arizona Project carries water from the Colorado River 336 miles uphill through central Arizona in a canal. And, you know, it was originally put into play in the 1990s, and actually the 80s, actually now that I think about the late 80s. But it was being discussed as early as 1930. And so it took about 50 years to get the thing from conceptual discussions like the one we're having right now to complete construction. And I don't know that we have that luxury of that much time in the conversations that we're having right now, but I guess the point is that, you know, I think at the time it was originally introduced, some people were like, rolled their eyes and said, that's crazy talk, why would anybody ever do that? And in fact, famously, the Phoenix superintendent of water in the 1950s said, sure, Phoenix will help contribute money to this thing, but we're never going to use Colorado River water in Phoenix because everybody knows that the Colorado River is too thick to drink and too thin to plow. And that was his statement at the time. So, you know, fast forward, it's 40% of our water supply today. So I think the answer to your question, Rhett, is that you just can't dismiss any options today. I think that we have to consider all possibilities in a climate that no one 30 years ago, 40 years ago, really could have conceived. Here we are. So never say never. You have to talk about all options, I think.
John?
First of all, I think we should recognize this is a very real question, particularly in Arizona. My wife and I recently were invited out to dinner by some dear family friends who told us they were leaving Tucson. And, you know, we thought their kids had moved on to college, that's why they're leaving. And they actually told us at dinner that no, they're leaving because they have concerns about the environmental sustainability, particularly water around the community of Tucson. And so we asked, where are you moving to? And they said Denver. And I'm like, well, you should have kept going because you're still in the basin. But this is a real world discussion. These are families making decisions. These are students making decisions about where they're going to go to school. And, you know, like Rhett, 2 or 3 years ago, I would not have looked, and this is from an avowed pipe and pump station builder, I confess. This is not a solution that I took all that seriously, but I now think in the portfolio of solutions that we need to manage in a programmatic fashion, I think this is now on the radar. These projects like CAP, they are generational, they're flagship, they take 20 or 30 years. And it's a good thing that they take 20 or 30 years, because I think the engineering and the science and the planning and the public policy and avoiding pipeline robbery that the last panel talked about, it's going to take time, because when we do move fast as engineers and scientists, we can inadvertently break things. And there's examples of a pipeline connects communities, and you have to be careful about how you connect those communities. We saw that in Flint. City of Tucson substantially dodged a serious issue by combining water sources in the past. We need to think about the communities on either end of that pipeline, the people whose backyards this might roll through along the way. But I do see now in that third tier of a portfolio, you begin with conservation and water reuse, you do more on the evolution of agriculture, you do a better job with groundwater, and then in that third bucket, I do think there's now due consideration has to be paid to a flagship project that might look like a large pipe.
Justin?
So when talking about this issue back home, and I live in New Orleans, just a few blocks from the Mississippi River, and we can see the levee from outside of our house. And it's a very real question. It's interesting. I think that over time you've heard people talk about this. Now people are I think much more focused on it, and we know the reasons why. What I very much agree with, and the Water Institute, we're an applied research group, so we tend never to put our thumb on one solution or another. Rather, with a thorny issue like this, where there's no right answer, what we tend to do is say, okay, let's take a step back. Let's look at what are all of the challenges in this space, both where you're trying to move the water, the area you'll move the water over, and the area that you're taking the water from. Look at all those challenges, and then lay out all the alternatives. I think we would all agree that this is not simply, is it the pipe or not, that it is a matter of an array of solutions ultimately to deal with the stressors that we're talking about. So when it comes to actually looking at the pipe, you would say, okay, this is one alternative, look at the host of others, and ultimately have a cohesive strategy. I think the thing that we would suggest the most from, we tend to use structured decision-making as our method to figure out how do you examine these various alternatives. When we start thinking about one-off approaches, I think we might put ourselves in danger. In Louisiana, a lot of our work is based on the experience of the Dutch. So they, of course, have been protecting their coastline for the last 800 years, and in 1953, they had their effectively Hurricane Katrina moment. And they've built massive infrastructure to protect their coastline. As they sometimes like to say, it's existential for us, and given that the majority of our country is below sea level, we really need to do this because we don't want to be Germans. And if we don't do this, we're going to be forced to move. Well, we've learned a lot from that experience, and one thing that we're seeing now in the Netherlands is that with many of these massive projects that they have built over the last 50 years, there are, as you said earlier, there are unintended consequences. So there is a need to go back now and do a lot of re-engineering. We have the opportunity to consider potential unintended consequences on the front end. And from the perspective of the Mississippi River as it goes through South Louisiana, we tend to think about the management of the river in three respects. There's navigation, ecosystem restoration, and flood risk reduction. So from a navigation perspective, we've, of course, suffered through recently a historic low water event. That makes moving goods up and down the Mississippi River much more difficult. You simply don't have enough draft, and the shoaling issue, the building up of sediment, becomes more extreme in those sorts of conditions. Concurrent with that historic low river event, just right before Christmas, the Army Corps of Engineers issued a permit decision on what's called the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion. Just a quick little bit of context here of the challenge we have in Louisiana. We are losing a football field of land every 100 minutes. It used to be every 60 minutes we were losing a football field, so the numbers have gotten a little bit better, but this is still an existential crisis. Since the 1920s, we've lost about the land mass of the state of Delaware. And unfortunately, as we know, there are nations that have gone to war to protect that amount of territory. And pulling from the previous panel, the communities that are getting most adversely impacted from this existential challenge are those that are already most disadvantaged in the first place. So to just lay out the issues that we would probably suggest you would need to focus on the most, maintaining that navigation channel is, of course, of vital importance to the economic security of our country. It also happens to be the greenest form of transportation. Moving goods on the river is greener than rail, greener than air, greener than road. So that's one part of it. And when we're thinking about the climate aspects of this, you might also need to, of course, consider, well, how much energy, once a pipe is built, how much energy is it actually going to take to move water across from the Mississippi River to the desert southwest? That is certainly a factor that we'll need to consider. You don't want to try to solve one problem while perpetuating another. We're also right now, that mid-Barataria sediment diversion I mentioned, that is in effect, we're cutting a hole effectively in the levee and building a controlled structure so that we can open it during high river events so that the sediment that drains 2/3 of the continental United States drain into the Mississippi River, our entire delta was created when the river would periodically flood. Well, now we're trying to, with this nature-based solution, mimic Mother Nature, harness the power of the Mississippi River. We care a lot more about the sediment than the water, but it's the water that transports it. So when that gate is open for the mid-Barataria diversion, and it's open at full blast, if you will, that's 75,000 cubic feet per second, which would make that approximately the 7th largest river in North America. So I guess in summary, when thinking about this, it's not to say we should or we should not do it. If plans like this went forward, we would certainly need to consider what are the potential known adverse consequences, what are the things that we might come across by moving water from one watershed to another in that sense. Maybe later we'll come back to some of the potential regulatory challenges. But none of this is to say that it should or shouldn't be done. I think ultimately in this nation, if we could have a national water policy, which a number of people have called for, you would have the opportunity to not evaluate proposals of this nature in a one-off, which could lead to, as we like to say in Louisiana sometimes, you could get random acts of restoration, which is a good project, but does it actually move the needle in the direction that you want to nationally? I think it'd be very interesting to apply a science-based decision-making method nationally, looking at both the pipe and the array of other alternatives, so that whatever decisions are ultimately made, and there's no way we can please everyone and address all issues perfectly, at least it can be informed by the best available science looking out across a larger timescale.
Now, when I started out as a young lawyer, I had someone refer a potential client to me who was a family member. That family member came and they had 2 ideas that they wanted to patent. One of them was that they wanted to train rattlesnakes to smell for drugs and bombs at the airport baggage claim. And the other was a giant pipeline from the Mississippi to move floodwaters to Arizona. And I basically thought these were equivalent ideas as a young lawyer. I thought this is about the level of both sides. Now, this person, when I bit my tongue and did the best that I could to take the ideas seriously, and they said, well, look, we move oil a really long distance. Why can't we move water a long distance? And my response was, do you want to pay for water what you pay for gasoline? It's just expensive. So there are obvious cost obstacles, but I'm curious from each of you, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to a large transboundary pipeline moving water from the Mississippi to the desert Southwest? What is the big obstacle?
Wow. I think the biggest obstacle is that you have to do the project in a way that doesn't provide a benefit to one party at the expense of another, right? It makes no sense to me. In the context of this conversation, I've always been one of those people that has thought, as your relative did, why not move floodwaters as opposed to straight ahead diversion of the regular flows of the Mississippi or the Missouri, and at the risk of throwing the other basin states in the West under the bus, I've always thought that it would be a great way for a pipeline to go from Louisiana through Texas across to Arizona. Why bother with the Rockies? Don't worry about the Rockies. You don't have to cross the Rockies. Just go the southern route, go the I-10. Which, isn't that a great idea, right? But I think it's important that the benefits accrue on both ends, right? It can't be take from one place to benefit another. It has to be something that, we're solving problems or advancing solutions, at least, on both ends. So I think that's the biggest challenge is that whatever it has to be, it has to provide mutual benefit on both ends. And I think by definition, that might limit the scope of the benefit to one side. So be it. I think that's what we have to do.
I think as soon as you step outside, I think we'll begin and continue in Arizona and other arid regions. You start locally, and then you start to look inside your basin. But as soon as you start looking outside your basin, and as soon as you start looking even outside your country, it's going to be the collaboration that is the tall hill that we need to climb. Right now I look at the Colorado River as a bit of a common good, and we're seeing, and I think the recent Colorado River Water Users Association conference in Las Vegas really confirmed this for me personally, listening to the discussions, is that we've got a lot of rational actors that are pursuing their own self-preservation from an aqueous point of view, and a lot of those rational actions are, they make a ton of sense for each individual actor, but in effect, my real concern is that a river system that is, actively being discussed about as being or approaching a state of crashing the river as a system and turning into a run-of-river system, that all of those rational actions, the tragedy of the commons, will actually force the river into that state sooner. And we're now talking, in a matter of years. There's some, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, we don't have this discussion. And I think the water community has figured this out, and I think our communities have figured it out. So if we can approach regional solutions and collaboration and really pursue those, co-benefiting solutions, as that's the starting point, that we will only consider co-benefiting solutions, it's that collaboration, convincing everyone, the city of Phoenix has a plan, and Tucson has a plan, and Ag has a plan, but bringing all those together, if we can foster that communication and collaboration and an honest accounting of how much water do we have, and when everyone puts their water demand plans and their grandiose ideas on the table, the gap that we need to address, if we can collaborate, we can do good things. I'm worried that we're going to have a lot of autonomous actions that don't really work well together.
I would very much agree with those comments, and I think others have suggested, and I mentioned earlier, the idea of a national water plan of some sort to really get at this exact challenge. The water, as we know, does not respect any of these jurisdictional boundaries that are so important to many of us. So I think that is absolutely one of the major impediments. I think the legal and regulatory hurdles of doing something like this in our existing regime are massive. It would take, many have argued it would take 20, 30 years with the current regime just to try to evaluate from an environmental impacts perspective, and the 40 to 50, probably more federal regulations and state regulations that would need to, processes that would need to be worked through. Just as Rhett said earlier, that's not a reason to say it can't be done. You can make your way through that. There can be legislation streamlining. So I think under current conditions, that would certainly be one of the major impediments. And then, again, from the perspective of being local to the Mississippi River, I think the challenge that you would find when you reduce stream power in the river, whether during normal conditions, low river or high water, you are going to necessarily create shoaling concerns. So the river needs to be dredged to maintain its depth. And that stream power is very important to pushing the sediment out, or in the case of the diversion program that I mentioned, pushing that sediment out to rebuild coastal wetlands. Again, none of these are things that are simply impossible to evaluate or to address. But the trade-offs, I think, from a policy perspective, again, recognizing that the Mississippi River is so important from that economic perspective as well as the ecosystem restoration perspective. The state of Louisiana just issued a draft of its 2023 Coastal Master Plan, and a major aspect of that strategy, of the strategy that we have in Louisiana to protect and maintain our wetlands and our very way of life, relies on harnessing the power of the Mississippi River for its sediment. So that, I think, would be a big challenge on this side of the equation, if that, even during flood times, because that's when we would have the diversion operated the most. So I think that there are certainly opportunities, again, to put out the full array of alternatives, evaluate them, seek the opportunities to streamline. I mean, our Congress is very effective and efficient these days, right? That was like, yeah, we could certainly, find opportunities to streamline legislation, and it can be done. I mean, post-Katrina in New Orleans, you saw a $15 billion, $14.5 billion levee reconstruction done faster than anyone had ever imagined something like that could be done. And I think it's a perfect example, again, back to Rhett's opening point. We know we can build. We know we can move through even regulatory hurdles if the nation is focused, and it was after Katrina in that respect. So I think the challenges are great, but we have no choice but to look at this solution and the full array of other alternatives.
And
Now-
before you get on to the next one, I wanted to say for anybody else other than Rhett and I, the lawyers in the room, we've already talked about the possibility too that there is that little thing about two completely different systems of water rights between the Mississippi and the West, and riparian rights versus prior appropriation, and where the two would absolutely collide on a project like this. So if anybody else in the audience is a lawyer and they're squirming in their seat going, hey, you guys didn't say that. We said it, okay?
Right, so just to touch on what Cynthia said, a interbasin transfer under riparian rights law would be presumed unreasonable. So it would just take one person in the basin who had a riparian right to bring a lawsuit, and any diversion, absent legislation, would likely go to court, and the court would say, I'm sorry, but the presumption here, unless you can demonstrate otherwise, is that this diversion is unreasonable. So it'd be pretty easy for one landowner
In Minnesota.
in Minnesota to shut the entire project down if you didn't find a way to change water right law. And if you want to change water rights law, now you're looking at eminent domain issues and all kinds of takings issues. Now, there's a lot of wonderful things about being a water lawyer, and especially a water law professor. And one of those wonderful things is I don't get a lot of hate mail. People don't send me hate letters much. Except once in my career. I got asked to write a think piece about a bulk water transport from Canada to the desert Southwest. And the paper I wrote was, sure, it could be done. There's a whole lot of obstacles to it. But ultimately, Canada already embeds a lot of its water in agricultural products and ships it away, so it effectively already does ship away a lot of water. This would just be doing it in raw water form in a pipeline. And Canadians sent me mean letters. Canadians! And people think, well, that wouldn't happen in a transboundary move within the United States, but I think people who think that think, well, you should look at the Colorado River and how strongly tribal members identify with the sovereignty of their tribe, how strongly states identify with the sovereignty of their states, that water is a symbol of sovereignty, that it has political value. So when people bring up all of the kinds of obstacles you're talking about, as well as the political and legal obstacles, what do you say that says, here's the upside, here's why you should think about it?
I think that I go back to my original point now, so I'll keep it brief, and that is the mutual beneficial aspects of it, right? I mean, when the first 10X conference we had in Baton Rouge, that was one thing we talked about, was the focus actually was on the too much water, because Houston had just gone through a major hurricane, and we were talking about, Louisiana and Texas, collective experience of too much water in certain parts. And I wish we could send that all to you. And we were like, well, we wish you really would. And so yeah, that would be, I think, the reason to do it.
I think there's the obvious potential unlocking of opportunities that are facing states like California, Arizona, New Mexico. All of the basin states are considering their water decisions in light of the opportunity and in light of what happens if they don't do anything, those other possible futures. So, you know, we're seeing, you know, people phone up and say, we're thinking of an industry in Queen Creek, Arizona. Do you have 50 MGD? And the answer is no, that doesn't exist right now. And those sorts of opportunities, I think, are, you know, whether it's Arizona Commerce Authority or different agencies, they're very much looking at, you know, how can the Arizona ag community serve even more of the world by increasing productivity? You know, not just cutting water for ag, but actually increasing productivity through an evolution of the Arizona ag economy. So I think it's, you know, the upside are the potential opportunities. And if we can thread our way between the existential threats we're facing all the way through to those opportunities, you know, I think there is an upside to, you know, very thoughtfully looking at, you know, on a Western U.S. level of the water resources and what's the best use we can make of them with a programmatic total portfolio solution that doesn't start with a big pipe.
Yeah, and I think that the reason to look at whether it's this solution, the pipe, or any other alternative is that we have no choice. We have no choice. We have to work through this set of issues. We can't wait. And I think the fact that that the pipe conversation, if you will, has come to the fore in the way it has over the last couple of years is really symbolic of the fact that we can't. We experienced this again, you know, after Katrina in New Orleans. There were many people who said, "Why are you going to rebuild? Why are you going to rebuild?" And we hear that a lot after many hurricanes, not just in Louisiana, but across the Gulf. And there are conversations underway in Louisiana and other parts of the Gulf around, are there communities that cannot maintain their way of life going forward? And what do you do given the increasing nature of the stressors and the challenges? One thing I think that we've all learned from that experience in our neck of the woods is you would never want to say that the only solution is abandon the areas that are currently facing water shortage and where it looks like that those challenges are just going to continue to increase. So I think the great advantage of this conversation is it can really focus our attention. And I hate to be repetitive on this point, but if you look across the country, we have different types of water challenges all across the country, right? And so when we start thinking about, you know, big infrastructure projects that capture our imagination, it just seems to me that we should allow our imagination to run, but we should look at it holistically. We should not just try to solve one challenge using one particular resource without, as we've already discussed, thinking about the adverse impacts that would accrue in this case, at the Mississippi River, or if you're looking at pulling from other rivers, where, you know, what would the challenges there be? But to be able to take a step back and say, and this is a big challenge to pull this off, I just am not sure that we have an alternative, because of the challenge of unintended consequences. So we have to continue to focus our minds in this respect. But it doesn't mean it's easy. But if it was easy, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
So I'm going to ask one more question of our panelists before we move to Q&A, and that is, so this has been done. Cynthia brought up a perfect example of a big infrastructure project that moved water a long way, the Central Arizona Project. There's been historically large bulk water transports from Malaysia into Singapore, but Singapore's trying to move away from that because they don't want to depend on their neighbor for their water supply. There's been bulk water transfers from Turkey into northern Cyprus, but that's driven a lot by ethnic and political concerns that aren't really about economics. So seeing that it is possible, but it's hard enough that even Singapore is looking to get out of that business, what's your thoughts on the comparative evaluation of a large pipeline? Compare it to, because a lot of people are just saying, well, you people just want to have your cake and you want to eat it too, right? Why don't you just save your water? Why don't you just tighten your belt and conserve your water and stop trying to solve your problem by taking other people's stuff? So comparing this to conservation or other augmentation options like desalination or cloud seeding, how do you compare a big pipeline to those conservation or augmentation?
I think that I get this question all the time. Well, why don't you guys just think about using less water? Well, we are thinking about using less. We're not just thinking about it, we are using less water, and we continue to use less water. But it's not so much an either or, it's a both and it's an all of the above. We're at a point right now in the west. I always like to say the west as opposed to the southwest because everyone thinks that, oh, Phoenix has the real problem, as if it's an isolated thing.
No.
If you don't know, I mean, if you really just don't know, the American West has a very significant problem in the Colorado River. Arizona alone is looking at losing, 2/3 or more of its supply. Today, based upon what the Bureau of Reclamation has told us is needed to keep the system literally from collapsing in the next 2 years, you could take all of the water that goes to Central Arizona through that Central Arizona project, you could shut it off, not send a drop downstream, and it will not make a dent in the problem. It will not. And that's not just a Phoenix perspective, that's just a known. We're talking about massive cuts of water. And so I say that only in the context of to come to the conclusion that there is no way to conserve our way out of this. That's not possible. Now, that's not to say that conservation is not a part, and actually, I would stop calling it conservation and really look at it as demand management, because you're doing more than just asking people to not run water while they brush their teeth. It is demand management. And so, yes, we have to look at demand management, but we know that demand management can't solve it. So what else are we gonna do? So we gotta do more. And so that's when we start looking at, not just an option of a big pipe, but options of we're looking at advanced water purification in Phoenix. That's something we're very much avidly looking at. Otherwise, direct potable reuse, it's the same thing. We're looking at desalinization. That is a very hot topic in Arizona right now. We're looking at, we'll probably increase groundwater pumping somewhat, but there is some very strong dangers in doing that as well. And so there are no options that are off the table. But the problem is we don't have the luxury of time to be able to say, well, we're going to concentrate on demand management first. And then once we've exhausted that, then we'll go on. There is no time for that. We simply do not have the time. We have to do all of the above right now.
One thing I love about this problem is that people have been talking about it for a very long time. We recently went back and researched over 90 separate interesting ideas that people have had dating back, as you said, to the 1930s. And, I think we need to have a common understanding. We need to do a really good job of communicating. Here are the different ideas. Here's what they mean in terms of a community impact, a social impact, an equity and a community justice side of things, obviously environmental, economic, and technical feasibility. I think we have to work to be able to compare these in a very, a well-reasoned and highly inclusive collaborative communication as a Western community, and then start to recognize the days of dropping a well in Arizona and putting in a booster pump in a tank and getting water for $400 an acre foot. It's over. You asked, what do I tell people? I said, Arizona is going to have water, but you're going to have to pay more for it, and that's a big community issue. And as what's possible at $1,000 an acre foot, $3,000 an acre foot, $10,000 an acre foot. All of a sudden, Las Vegas with its turf program, or looking at evaporative cooling and moving away from evaporative coolers. Is energy or water the constraint in the desert? We need to think about that. And I think, as you go all the way up, well, all of a sudden raising Bartlett Dam by 100 feet starts to make sense to a Salt River project, and desal starts to make sense, and brackish groundwater desal in the West Valley of Phoenix makes sense. But it's all at the right time and at the right place after we've gone through that process. We really need to do the process correctly.
Yeah, well, I agree with both of your comments, and I think that the only way that we'll be able to come up with the ideal solution, and recognizing, once again, ideal is not perfect. There is no perfect. We wouldn't be sitting here if there was. Requires just the evaluation, the rigorous evaluation of all the alternatives, because it's not simply a matter of is there desal or not. It's a question also of how much. How much do you invest there? And so being able to map out, again, that full array of alternatives. I mean, my colleague Alyssa Dousman, I think, is going to speak on the next panel. Just locally in Baton Rouge, we're looking at the issue of the Southern Hills Aquifer, which represents some of the best drinking water really in the world. And for years, we've had many people pulling from it, including industry that's right next to the Mississippi River. So there's a conversation underway right now, again, following the structured decision-making approach, of, well, to what extent would one require industry to pull directly from the Mississippi River? What are the economics of that? What's the long-term sustainability of that option? What is the true danger to the aquifer? And for most of us, we just can't put our heads around the full array of alternatives unless we go through that rigorous, that very rigorous process. So I think what we tend to be very optimistic in Louisiana. We don't have a lot of choice. It's a tough neighborhood for a variety of reasons. But I really agree that by looking at these alternatives through the economic, environmental, social equity lenses, we can not just all recognize, which I think everybody on this panel does, that it requires an all-of-the-above approach, but thinking about how do you adjust the bass and the treble and, on each of the potential alternatives to try to maximize the overall benefits while minimizing the costs. And I think, as an aside, we're getting much better as a nation at thinking about the manner in which we evaluate costs and benefits for major water resource projects. The Corps of Engineers is now going to go through a public process with a draft rule coming out to formally indoctrinate in the benefit cost analysis process, looking not just at the economics of a particular challenge, but also requiring rigorous metrics around the environmental and social and equity aspects of making decisions. So I feel optimistic that we're moving towards a framework where we can evaluate the full array of alternatives and ideally make the best informed decisions. Again, it won't be easy, but the challenge that we face rightly has us focused.
The thing I tell a lot of people when they ask is they say, are we running out of water in Arizona? And I say, we're not running out of water. We're running out of cheap water. That's what we're running out of.